These two watches are some of the most fascinating steel sports Rolex pieces I have ever discussed and focused on. And what's amazing is that this whole experience of being able to write about the art and design of watches, you spend a lot of time focusing on these pieces. 10 hours is normally my average when it comes to preparing videos. And both of these pieces continually pull me back and beg me to ask more questions about why they are so successful, why are they so interesting. So my thinking behind this discussion was to look at both of them at the same time, run through their details, some of their design specifics, and just see the flip side of the coin for each of them, because they are both so similar but so different in the way that they have approached the whole concept of being made for the sake of adventure and exploration. So of course we all know that the hype for steel sports Rolex is through the roof at this point, and vintage steel sports Rolex is just on another level. I will link to a video in the corner discussing that in more detail. But these two watches are very different in the way that they approach the idea of steel sports pieces. I don't see the 1016 Explorer as a sports watch. I see it more as a dress watch more than anything else. And if you look at the 1655 Explorer 2, I don't see it as a sports watch at all. I actually see it as a tool watch, which I plan on discussing more in a second. I'm not going to bog you down with the history of the Explorer and how it developed. I'm sure most of us know the story. Instead, I would like to just focus on them both and look at some of the details that really fascinate me about them. The 1016 Explorer, it's a watch that's been discussed to death, and it really is such a charming piece of design. Intelligent use of space, of style. It can very well be understood that this watch is a perfect one watch for any collection. And what is most interesting is that you look at this watch and you could say that any enthusiast on any side of the spectrum, whether you are a Omega enthusiast, Patek Philippe, Rolex, Breguet, Longines, any kind of family of watches, you look at this piece and you can appreciate it for what it is, what it manages to do. It is simplicity encapsulated in such a small and unique package. Nowadays it commands such a presence, and that's the most interesting part. You can wear a 36mm 1016 and have the same amount of pull that you would probably have if you were wearing a 5196 Calatrava, for example. This watch, in its small size, is able to command such a presence in any environment. The styling of the watch, it is very much a 50s styled piece, but we look at where we are now and this watch is just as interesting, as eye-catching and absorbing as it was back then. So it is a marvel of simplistic watch design. And of course this is not a method that Rolex introduced. Watches had been using batons and numerals years before the time. But the way this watch has been executed with regards to its proportion, its size, the bracelet integration, it looks very compact and unique, and it is a very interesting splice of a sports and dress sort of character. I'll emphasize, I don't see it as a sports watch as much as I see it as a more casual dress watch more than anything else. Which is quite ironic because this watch was designed around the foundation of being an explorer's instrument. But then we move to the 1655. And it is, I would say, one of the biggest leaps in Rolex's developmental history with regards to just the sheer amount of development that happened between 1 and 2. We compare it to the GMT line, for example, the GMT Master and the GMT Master 2. There's barely any difference when you look at it in comparison to these two watches. They are completely different. And of course, referring back to the statement of it being the Explorer 1 being more of a dress sports piece, the Explorer 2 goes in a completely opposite direction, being more of a highly functional utility instead of being this formal amalgamation of sports and dress. Both of these watches have a different allure to me. The Explorer 1 looks like a watch that's very pleasing, very charming, very encapsulating in the way it presents itself. The Explorer 2, you look at it and you think, what is that thing? You have no idea. It takes you a second to realize that it is a watch, and you don't really know which way is up and what it's trying to do, which is strange because generally watches, the best watches, should be able to communicate their designs easily. The Explorer 2, on the other hand, has a difficult time of kind of arranging itself. You think at first that it might be a navigator's instrument or some kind of compass or just a general altimeter or something. You don't actually have a full understanding of what it's trying to represent. Then only after looking at it for a while do you realize it has an AM, PM indicator and a date complication, a strange fixed bezel. And that's when it gets more interesting. When you consider watches to be almost like art, the best art is what keeps you drawn and interested in the whole process. And both of these watches do that. You are fixated on them for different reasons, and your attention and focus moves around the dial. You can appreciate the little aspects that they all represent, and this is mainly why I'm so fascinated by them both. Again, bringing them both together to the front, they represent such different areas, but at the same time they manage to do the same thing. They keep you drawn, and they couldn't be more different. But the joke is they are in the same family and are in fact a part of the same line. If I had to ask everyone which you would be more interested in, I'm sure the 1016 would get all the praise and attention because it is just simplicity personified. The 1655, on the other hand, is a watch that interests me more, just because it is so strange in its styling. Where I said that the 1016 has a very 50s aesthetic around it, the 1655 looks rooted in the 70s. Where the 1016 looks to be a watch that has been able to transcend the time and is now just as gorgeous in the way it presents itself now as it did 50 years ago, 60 years ago. This watch, the 1655, looks like it's still linked to the 70s in many ways. And maybe that's a reason why I like it. The big orange hand, the strange dial, the strange hands, none of it makes sense, in fact. And that might be the reason that really pulls me. Because design is all about perfection. It's about trying to get to a point when you can say, yes, this thing is perfect. The Explorer 1 is so close. I mean, it is pretty much teetering on the top end of the scale. Where the Explorer 2, with a strange squared off case with crown guards, a date window with this large high top plexiglass crystal, it just doesn't make much sense in the scheme of things. When you compare it to, I don't know, the Submariners, the GMTs, they have a more directed function. So this watch in many ways looks to be old-fashioned, dated, strange, peculiar, but that's what really keeps your attention there. That's what makes you think more and more. And what I like so much about the dial layout and the integration with the hands and the large GMT hand, because the case is so simple, your eyes are drawn to the hands on the dial, and every few minutes you'll notice just the sheer amount of change that these four hands represent in that space. Everything moves, so you have the GMT hand moving, the hour and minute hand being placed in different areas, and you don't have much to appreciate on the whole when you look at the watch. But you can appreciate the subtleties of where the hands are placed, the details of the minute track, where all the batons are placed, the integration between the bracelet and the case. It looks very much like a tool. And I will emphasize again, where I see the Submariner as a sports watch, this watch looks the furthest away from a sports instrument as you can get. This looks like a tool. It looks like something you would wear when you are doing the most extreme tasks, like climbing mountains, sailing across the seas. And it has that presence of being something built for application and purpose. I would say it's built for these purposes even more than the Submariner, in the way it visually represents itself. I look at these two watches, the 1016 and the 1655, and think to myself, these would make such a good pairing in a collection. These could be your only two watches. You keep the Explorer 1 for the simpler, the more casual occasions, and the Explorer 2 for the more complex, hard-wearing situations. Of course, nowadays you can't exactly afford them, unless you were given them by chance or you bought them at a very good time. The demand for these pieces have just gone through the roof. But where we see how the Submariner and the GMT has caught on and become such popular watches in the Rolex family, these Explorer pieces have been sleeper watches for the most part. These watches were not highly prized like the Paul Newman Daytonas that just got an insane amount of coverage. We look at the 1655 and could say that it is the most ugliest looking duckling of them all, especially in comparison to some of the more streamlined, simple watches that had a clearer purpose behind their designs. This watch, especially with all of its character, its bravado, its 70s charm, really manages to hit all sorts of different points and continues to be such a fascinating, complicated piece for that reason. And in a way, I think the best designs are the ones that you can keep returning back to and keep thinking about ideas and ways of how you could best address what they have done. And with both of these watches, though their approaches are completely different spectrums, you look at them and you can appreciate them for different reasons. Is there more about the piece that you could, pun intended, explore? I find them such fascinating pieces of design. Some of the most interesting and engaging watches in the Rolex sports line. And why these two watches will remain in the back of my mind as ultra grails, probably for the rest of my life.